Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Xavier Salomon. I'm the Peter J. Sharp Chief Curator at the Frick Collection. And I would like to welcome you all this evening for our last lecture linked to the exhibition Tiepolo in Milan, The Lost Frescoes of Palazzo Archinto, which I co-curated with two Italian colleagues and friends, Professor Andrea Tomezzoli at the University of Padua and Dr. Dennis Ton at the Musei Civici in Belluno. It is a great honor for me tonight to welcome one of the great experts on Giambattista Tiepolo in this country, in the world, Professor William Barcham. He received his doctoral degree here in New York at the Institute of Fine Arts, where he studied Venetian art and culture, and an interest of his which has carried on throughout his career, several last decades. He's written a long series of articles and exhibition essays, too long to list tonight, but I will talk a little bit about his books, which are focused on several Venetian subjects, from the imaginary views of Canaletto to books focusing on the art of Tiepolo himself. And of course, he is the author of the seminal book, The Religious Paintings of Giambattista Tiepolo, Piety and Tradition in 18th Century Venice, which was published in 1989, and it's still the key work on religious Tiepolo to this day. More recently, after a fellowship at the Morgan Library, he's also published more sort of directly related to the talk tonight, a book on Tiepolo's pictorial imagination, The Drawings for Palazzo Clerici. And tonight, Professor Barcham is talking indeed about Tiepolo's work in Milan. But his work has also focused on other subjects, including a biography of Federico Cornaro, who was Gian Lorenzo Bernini's patron for the celebrated Cornaro Chapel in Santa Maria della Vittoria in Rome. He has been the recipient of many grants and awards from the Metropolitan Museum, from the Delmas Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Philosophical Society, National Endowment for the Humanities. And between 1998 and 1999, he was also a fellow at the American Academy in Rome. Over the last years, together with Professor Puglisi of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, they've been studying together a rather fascinating topic, the figure of the man of sorrows in Venetian art across the centuries in the modern period, which is an enterprise that has brought them all the way back to the Middle Ages, and both of them are experts, of course, in 17th, 18th century art. So this has been a far-reaching research. And an exhibition was co-curated at the Museum of Biblical Art here in New York in 2011 with a wonderful accompanying catalog. But the book on the subject, which will no doubt be a fascinating and wonderful contribution to the study of Venetian art, is expected to be published later this year. Professor Barcham, more recently, between 2014 and 16, has taught at the University of Venice on Venetian 18th century art. And tonight, he will be talking to us about Tiepolo's Milanese frescoes, so not only about Palazzo Archinto, but also about other palaces and enterprises from around that time and in the same city. At this point, I would like to remind you all to turn your phones off. The lecture will be recorded and will be available on our website. And finally, the exhibition, which is on here at the Frick till July 14th, will be open tonight for viewing for about half an hour after the lecture. So please join me in welcoming Professor William Barcham.
Thank you, Xavier, for that very generous and kind introduction, and of course for inviting me here to speak this evening. You see here one of the few surviving fragments of the fresco of the Palazzo Archinto, which is dated 1731. And as many of you, most of us, are Americans, I would just like to point out that George Washington was born the next year in 1732, and that it is very likely, given the timing, that he was conceived while Tiepolo was working in Milan on these frescoes. In a recent issue of the New Yorker magazine, Peter Schjeldahl wrote that many find Tiepolo, I quote, hard to appreciate. Does he, Schjeldahl, Or do any of you belong to that group? The crowds in the room at the top of the grand staircase at the Met insist that much of the public is actually absorbed by his art. And this talk is aimed at those who appreciate his art and who may want to know more. Now, before tracing what I have called Tiepolo's giant footsteps in Milan, that is, his 3 fresco cycles in palaces in the Lombard capital, it's necessary to think for a moment about where those steps are imprinted. They're in a world that is not what we think it is or was, nor is it a world that we're accustomed to. First, Milan, obviously, is not Venice. But in taking for granted that Tiepolo was Venetian and therefore Italian, we cannot take for granted that Milan and Venice were Italian cities as we know them today. In the 18th century, we're still in pre-unification Italy when Venice was a millennial-old independent republic, its government ruling not just the city, lands on the mainland, west and north of the city, and islands in the Adriatic. When Tiepolo left Venice to paint in Milan in 1730, he was not just traveling westward across North Italy, he was actually crossing into another state, where a Venetian emissary was in residence. And just an interesting fact that Venice had ambassadors in cities that were capitals of independent states. They did not send ambassadors to Milan or to Naples because Milan belonged to Austria and Naples belonged to Spain. So the ambassadors there were not ambassadors, they were called residents, and they ranked much lower. This foreign state in Milan, part of the Austrian-Hungarian Habsburg Empire, had frontiers that bordered Venice twice. On the west, Milan itself, and on the north, leading to Vienna, the capital city. This is the Veneto, which mainly was the central part of the Venetian Republic, and you can see the regions on the map on the right. Milan had lost its independence as a city in the 16th century, and essays in the exhibition catalog make that clear, and it became part of Spain. But in the early 18th century, it fell to the Austrian crown. While Venetians knew that their government ruled from the ducal palace in the city, the Milanese understood that a governor sent by the emperor in distant Vienna administered them. Venetians spoke, and still speak today, a dialect not always comprehensible elsewhere on the peninsula. Milanese, too, spoke their own dialect, neither Italian nor obviously Venetian, but their rulers spoke German or Spanish. And to complicate issues of civic patriotism further, although all Milanese families owed allegiance to the Habsburg crown in the decade under discussion this evening, 30 to 40, these same families, 2 decades earlier, owed allegiance to Spain. But Venetians had been Venetians seemingly since time immemorial. So to appreciate Tiepolo's Milanese frescoes, we have to keep in mind that he worked in the city for an urban nobility whose members knew and sometimes were related and visited each other, but who owed allegiance to a foreign power. Furthermore, we are entering a world culturally, as you obviously would understand, very different from ours. And with that, I am referring to the allegories and mythologies Tiepolo represented in his 3 Milanese fresco cycles. Do we understand why these subjects and themes occupy so much of his art and why his patrons were so preoccupied with them? They were, in effect, behavioral goals. Certainly the allegories were ideals of behavior, standards for action, and they point to moral or ethical values. The principal allegory in this painting at the Met is valor, the man sitting in the center. Speaks for itself, I think, as does fame above. But are we sure in today's world what nobility connotes? Prudence, abundance, and truth. Although at the compositional center of Tiepolo's painting, truth today is rather marginal, not essential, a variable. Of course, Tiepolo's patrons didn't always live up to these principles either, but they implicitly accepted them as paradigms befitting noble behavior. What about the gods of mythology? Well, even the 18th century knew the ancient deities belonged to a long-gone culture. Witness Tiepolo's own Jupiter and Danae, painted in 1736 after he had already painted 2 palaces in Milan. Jupiter, or Jove, here is a comic figure, old and hoary and apparently breathless. Is he really able to seduce Danae, which is what the myth narrates? Certainly, Danae is not very interested in the ungainly old fellow. And their encounter humorously plays against the standoff between her feisty, yelping terrier and Jupiter's screeching eagle. But in the Clerici Palace in 1740 in Milan, on your left, Jupiter is vigilant and reigns high in the clouds. In fact, that's the point here and in Tiepolo's other Milanese ceilings. His imagination was celestial, and his figures hover and fly in the firmament. His protagonists belong to eternity, and they are perpetual lodestars for principled behavior. These are the dominions our painter's Milanese patrons believed should not only ornament their public rooms, they also defined what nobles deemed worthy and aspired to. Now, Tiepolo was up to the job, as we say. The exhibition catalog makes clear that he began this kind of work early on. Here is a fresco, that is, the room is frescoed. He painted at age 23 in a private villa on the Venetian mainland, a story taken from Ovid's Metamorphoses, one of the classical texts that Italian and other painters and their patrons turn to again and again. Tiepolo's teacher, Gregorio Lazzarini, had trained him in this tradition. Lazzarini is little known or valued outside of Venice today, but he spent much of his career depicting such mythological and historical scenes. His late 17th and early 18th century art is boldly rhetorical, and no matter the subject, he turned to ancient art for his ideas. The so-called Torso Belvedere in the Vatican museums, one of the most famous of ancient Greek fragments, served him as a model for the young Isaac of the Jewish Bible. And look at how faithful, yet how clever a student Tiepolo was. His Isaac is recognizably a restatement of Lazzarini's, but he was a very different painter from his teacher. Tiepolo painted this fresco on the ceiling of the gallery of the Archbishop's Palace in Udine. And this is a slide with pieces pieced together, so you see the seams from one image to another. Udine is on historically Venetian territory. You can see it in the center of the slide on your right. But at the time that Tiepolo was painting, the Austrian crown, Vienna, claimed the territory. And the emperor challenging Venice was Charles VI on your left, the same man who was governing Milan, where Tiepolo worked in the 1730s. Tiepolo's frescoes in Udine, and here is the gallery top with the sacrifice of Isaac below, employs stories of the Jewish Bible to register a protest against Charles VI's territorial claims to Udine. Now, why is this pertinent to Milan? So a little introduction. Well, it's pertinent for 2 reasons. First, painters like Tiepolo often used mythological, allegorical, or Hebraic themes to refer to a then-current geopolitical circumstance. And here, the Jewish stories are a rhetorical language conveying an underlying political subtext. Tiepolo's frescoes in both Udine and Milan must be read on multiple levels. They are not merely complicated tales for us today, told to decorate splendid interiors. Tiepolo's work in Udine is relevant to Milan, too, for a second reason, one that is paradoxical, I think, because if while frescoing in Udine, he was voicing Venetian protests against imperial political pretensions emanating from Vienna, what were his thoughts in Milan when he was obliged to serve the local nobility serving Vienna? To put it precisely, In Udine, Tiepolo's frescoes remonstrated against Charles VI, but in Milan, they support Charles VI. Like Michelangelo, Leonardo, Rubens, and Bernini before him, Tiepolo dutifully responded to his patron's needs. His private thoughts, however, were just that, private, and we are rarely privy to them. The archbishop who commissioned the frescoes in Udine belonged to the Venetian Dolfin family, written more or less like dolphin, with an F. Another member of the same family hired Tiepolo to paint a remarkable series of ancient Roman stories for his palace in Venice. And you know some of those paintings because they are at the top of the grand staircase at the Metropolitan Museum. And this cycle is our easy gateway to Milan, for Tiepolo completed these giant canvases in 1729, just before he left Venice for Charles VI's Lombard capital. The ancient narratives articulate civic, moral, heroic deeds, focusing on ethical choices, physical courage, altruism, and leadership, all themes the Dolfin family of Venice employed in two ways: to articulate the moral history of the family itself and to offer principles to which future generations must adhere. Now, because the paintings ornamented the salone, or principal hall of the palace, they self-advertised the family before friends, guests, and compatriots. And here I've photoshopped two of the paintings onto the mirrors. The mirrors now replace the paintings, and this is the principal hall, the reception hall, in what was then Palazzo Dolfin, which is that building is now the central seat of the University of Venice. As the stories of these paintings are Roman, their themes were considered everlasting, voicing heroic valor for early modern society. Trained in a language that was dramatic and rhetorical, some might even say hyperbolic, Tiepolo used that language, however, with refinement and charm, and couched it amidst erudite archaeological references, which is exactly what he did in Milan. Now, here is a city plan of Milan. Those of you who know the city, the train station in German is up at the very top. The Duomo, or the cathedral, is towards the bottom, both encircled in purple, the sites of his three palaces, the Palazzo Arquinto in red at the bottom. Tiepolo arrived in the city at age 34 to undertake a massive commission for Carlo Arquinto, who was a learned nobleman loyal to the Habsburg court, which is the subject of this exhibition. But a few years earlier, Arquinto had been invested with the Order of the Golden Fleece in 1700 and named a grandee of Spain just before Spain lost Milan. Arquinto did not protest foreign domination of a city, but facilitated and supported it, switching from Spain to Vienna as the situation needed. Here is his palace then and today, but what stands now is a reconstruction, as Allied bombing destroyed the building in August 1943. And let's remember that even Leonardo's not-so-distant Last Supper was vulnerable. You see it on the right, prepared for bombing, and on the left, after bombing. And it was saved because extraordinary precautions had been taken, but also because no bomb landed directly on the refectory, as it did on Palazzo Arquinto. The Allies were aiming at the nearby train station, not the central train station, but the one on the upper left in, I don't know if that's black or purple, I don't remember, the Cadorno station, which brings commuters in and out of the city. You can see the site of the Leonardo fresco to your left, and more or less the circle at the bottom is where the Palazzo Arquinto is. The Tiepolo's 5 ceilings were destroyed in the blink of an eye as a bomb hit the palace directly. Each was in a separate room, and they all depicted mythological stories and allegorical themes. Now, I hardly need repeat the excellent explanations of the cycle in the essays by Xavier Solomon and Dennis Ton in the catalog, but several points are worth emphasizing. At least 2 of the ceilings refer to the marriage of Arquinto's son, Filippo, with Giulia Borromeo on April 22nd, 1731, the date that's inscribed on the fresco. The first of the 2 was Perseus and Andromeda, whose oil sketch graces the Frick collection here and was in effect the trigger for the current exhibition. Now, if ever there was a fraught but finally successful marriage, it's this one. Jealous of Andromeda's beauty, a group of sea nymphs, the Nereids, complained to the god Poseidon, who then flooded the land. Andromeda's father, the king of Ethiopia, learned that the only way to save his daughter was to chain her to a rock above water level. And though a monster would threaten her, the waters would eventually descend. Now, by happy coincidence, Perseus was passing by after having killed Medusa, and he fell in love with Andromeda at first sight. He killed the monster, married the princess with her father's consent, and they had 7 children. Now, I point out several aspects in Tiepolo's work to pay attention. First, he was, as always, a terrific storyteller. The narrative unfolding along a zigzagging diagonal composition. The sea monster at bottom right, the jealous Nereids to the left, the bridal couple soaring freely through the heavens after Andromeda's release, and the parents beseeching Jupiter, who solves all predicaments. But note how, comparing the sketch with the destroyed fresco, how at this point in his career, 1730, Tiepolo closely hewed to his oil sketch when transferring his ideas onto his ceiling. He did add Andromeda's father to the story. He is central. He doesn't appear in the oil sketch. But also pay attention to how Tiepolo freed Perseus and Andromeda in their flight. The horse's rear legs are seen against the rock on the right and against the heavens on the left, which completely must have changed the sense of the movement in the fresco. Many of the individual elements nonetheless remain the same. The Nereids, for instance, except for one change, but sky and space increase, as do the distances between the groups. As for the colors, well, sadly, there are no color photos of the frescoes themselves, but I think we can assume that the colors of the frescoes more or less followed those of the sketches. The second of the 2 nuptial ceilings, referencing the approaching marriage, portrays Juno, Venus, and Fortune as an allegory. Juno, of course, was the goddess of marriage. I've pointed them out in blue. Venus, of course, of love and beauty. And Fortune, or Fortuna, her back turned to us, sits on a wheel, the wheel of fortune. She represents neither wealth nor opulence, as our English word implies, although, of course, these 2 families getting married were very wealthy, but rather providence and destiny. The figure to the right is circled in yellow is Zephyr, the springtime wind, who crowning the 2 families' coats of arms is the same wind allegory that Tiepolo painted for a Venetian family for another marriage a few years later. And I'm pointing out this ceiling on your right for a very specific reason in a moment. In Venice, Tiepolo painted the figure not in fresco, but in oil on canvas set into his ceiling. And of course, in both instances, Zephyr, the spring wind, gives voice to what sincere people hope for in marriage, a benevolent future. Now, Tiepolo worked up his ideas and compositions for these paintings in 2 ways, through study and artistic practice. His study sometimes departed from the usual channels, and that's why I've showed you this slide. For example, Zephyr's wings reproduce actual dragonfly wings, showing what are called eye spots. And the species he depicted, the Pseudomaris, exists only, today at least, in Morocco and in Iran. I am not an entomologist, ladies and gentlemen. This was pointed out to me several years ago in a wonderful email with an article. I can send the article to anybody who wants it, by a professor, an entomologist in Italy, Roberto Pantaleoni. He deserves credit for this. Now, did this rare creature once fly in Italy? I believe, I have to assume, that Tiepolo saw the dragonfly in Archinto's palace. We know that the Milanese nobleman was erudite. He was interested in the sciences and in natural history too. He had to have had a collection of rare fauna. Someone surely did. because I don't think any of us can vision Tiepolo net in hand, chasing a dragonfly and then pinning the creature down, certainly not in the centers of Milan or Venice. Tiepolo's study also comprised 2 standard manuals that he mined for some of his imagery. Here are the title pages. Vincenzo Cartari's on your right, Immagini degli Dei, and on your left, Cesare Ripa's Iconologia, with images and elucidations of the gods and allegories. And here on the right is a simple woodcut from Ripa's book for the allegory of liberality. It also carries a text in the book. I chose her among the hundreds available because she is the central protagonist on the next fresco commission for Milan in the Palazzo Casati, the fresco that Tiepolo began immediately upon finishing his work for Quinto. Note that Tiepolo has paraphrased liberality. He rarely copied these images directly. Rather than holding 2 cornucopias, a single horn of plenty falls in space, coins and other paraphernalia fall from it. Prudence and magnanimity sit on either side of her, and as you will see in a moment, fame trumpets her renown far above. And we shall return to this eagle on the left, because strange as it might seem to you, a Milanese eagle is not a Venetian eagle. Tiepolo's second Milanese, and here is the entire ceiling. I should point out to you that the Palazzo Arquinto is destroyed, the Palazzo Casati and clergy are not open to the public. You need special permission to see them, although it is easier, I think, to see the Palazzo Clerici than the Palazzo Casati. Unlike Arquinto, Casati was born poor. In fact, he was a tavern laborer and a sometime peddler of dried fish. So how did he get to do this, pay for this? Well, he worked his way up. He became a wealthy merchant, and finally, and this was key, he served the imperial Habsburg administration as a bureaucrat collecting taxes on the importation of goods in and out of the city. So every time goods went in and out of a gate in Milan, one has to assume Casati got something, particularly in the 18th century when the importation of tobacco became a major commercial success. In the late 1720s, before Tiepolo painted this, Emperor Charles VI, that same emperor, ennobled Casati as a count. And the Habsburg edict in the Viennese archives refers to the new count's virtues, his feats and labors, and his ascent to what is called imperial glory. Following tradition, the count was obligated to procure feudal rights in the countryside, which he did in 1730. So he was now not just wealthy, he was now a count. And he also purchased land and houses in the city. Now you see it at the top, on what is today's Via Manin. He restructured the existing buildings into a grand palace. The red line on the left is what you see on the right. And he raised the Salone, the principal hall, to the height of 40 feet. Now, 40 feet at that time was the highest interior space in the entire city. So I'm not talking about cathedrals and churches, but the highest private interior space in the city. Given the increased height of the Salone, Casati asked Tiepolo to fresco 3 Roman stories along the upper balcony, and you can see 2 of them on your right and your left. Here is the one you cannot see, and to get some idea of the size, these are frescoes I forget the word now. Frescoes now applied to canvas, but you can see the size of it by looking at the restorers who are putting it back into place. And these are the other 2. Because of Casati's rags to riches story under Charles VI, the man owed the emperor a great deal. And it is not coincidental that the eagle of liberality, so strikingly portrayed in the fresco, evokes here the Habsburg eagle, imperial liberality. So a Milanese eagle had a valence or value that it did not have in Venice. No Venetian patrician would have thought of an eagle as an imperial or Habsburg eagle. It was simply an eagle. If it was Jupiter's eagle, it was his symbol. In this context, let us remember that Tiepolo was the same man who only 5 years earlier had given voice to a cycle of paintings in Udine protesting Charles's imperial ambitions, indeed using stories from no less a book than the Bible to demonstrate unequivocally that Charles was aggressive and was encroaching upon Venetian sovereignty and tradition. Now, did Tiepolo's art change artistically from one year to the next as he moved across town, from one palace to the other? Now, our answer, sadly, has to depend upon a comparison between destroyed ceilings and one that still exists, between photos held in the hand and a view of the Casati Fresco overhead. First, let's remember that the Casati Fresco is 40 feet overhead, so far away that details are difficult to read from below, but also distant enough that the entire ceiling can be viewed at once. And I think one thing you learn, or at least I certainly learned, when you spend a lifetime studying Tiepolo, is that he adapted his art to each venue he worked in. No two interiors are alike. No two ceilings are at the same distance. No two rooms have the same doors in and out. No two rooms demand of the viewer down below the same viewpoint. And of course, no two patrons wanted the same thing. Now, we don't know the height of the several rooms in Palazzo Arquinto, but they surely varied. Yet if we ask the question regarding change again, we note that whereas the coved vault on the left, excuse me if I say this, you all know what a coved vault is. The walls go up, the ceiling is flat, and the coved vault is the part that curves up, in both cases, connecting the plumb walls with the flat ceiling. So the cove of the vault on the left was decorated with surface ornamentation. That is, it was just meant to look like feigned grill work and elegant reliefs. Whereas the Casati vault on the right was transformed into architecture, so that the illusionistic heavens beyond seem far, far distant. The figures on the right seem almost inaccessible, surely much more remote than those on the left. The Arquinto sky on the left seems pressed close to the oval that surrounds it, but the Casati heavens on the right appear to surge away from their opening. How else did Tiepolo's art change? These two images reveal that this is only a difference of 1 year or so, that space or void becomes as important as the solids in the composition. Clusters of figures take up 1/2 of the painting at the left, whereas in the painting on the right, the allegories are barely tethered in space. Of course, one is a mythology and the other is an allegory. Humans are conditioned by gravity, whereas on the right, they are on clouds, the gods and the allegories. But there is a decided shift away from heft to airiness. And if we look at one of the frescoes destroyed on the right, two sides of it, we see architecture within the painting, not leading up to the painting, within the painting, yoking or weighing the image downwards. Whereas in the painting in the Palazzo Casati, the architecture pushes the ceiling away. And I have to say, too, that in this period, Tiepolo continued to learn to embolden his figural foreshortening, often doing so in a light-hearted manner. For instance, 2 fractional legs in a forearm angled on the imaginary bolding abbreviate an entire human being, or an entire person of some kind, so that just as one figure on your bottom right, on the right slide, falls towards us, another at left tips backwards and away from us, so they sort of balance or set each other. Now, unlike the Arquinto ceilings, the Casati fresco lacks any surviving oil sketch. We know of no oil sketch, nor is it unquestionably associated with any drawing. Yet 2 remarkable drawings exist that I and a colleague, Anthony Panzera, have written about, linking them to the Casati fresco. So this is a hypothesis. I believe in it, but maybe not everybody does. I'll show you the 2 drawings briefly. One belongs to the Museo Horn in Florence, which is just behind the Uffizi, and the other is here in New York in the Morgan Library, the same subject on a slightly larger piece of paper, and adds this remarkable architectural surround that, replete with sculpture figures and little amorini, fictively rises many feet towards the sky. Now, while examining this sheet in the Morgan study room, we discovered that it has 10 tiny pinpricks, not holes accidentally torn across the centuries, but holes creating a precise plan, determining the opening to the sky, which has been rounded at the four corners to create an elegantly shaped architectural frame. But that is not all. Every straight architectural line in the fictive system leads to a vanishing point, and there are 3 of them. Now, what does one make of all this? How do we interpret the holes in the grid? Why was this very complicated system created? Well, given the finished quality of the drawing and its grid, we have to conclude that the sheet responded to a specific commission. Tiepolo didn't do this for fun. Either the patron withdrew or the plans changed. So it is our thesis, my colleagues and I will not try to convince you here, that this drawing was transformed for many reasons into, the Casati ceiling in Milan. It is essential to remember that he had the ceiling altered. Now, before we look at the last ceiling, the clerici ceiling, I will emphasize what we have so far seen regarding the first 2 ceilings. Tiepolo traveled abroad to work for a foreigner under a foreign emperor. He used a pictorial language reserved for ambitious ideas and noble ideals. He produced drawings and sketches for approval by his patrons. He painted in fresco, a quasi-permanent technique employed in Italy for centuries, and whose most famous exponent, of course, among most of us, was Michelangelo. He collaborated in both ceilings with other artists, specialists in architectural structures, what is called quadratura, coming from the Italian word quadro. And finally, Tiepolo climbed scaffolding every day to work, 40 feet at the Casati Palace. He spent hours with his neck craned, climbed down in the evening, his face and clothes soiled from dripping paint, and he did this for half a century. He left Milan in 1732, but returned 5 years later in 37 to fresco a chapel in the venerable Basilica of Sant'Ambrogio, St. Ambrose, the church dedicated to the patron saint of Milan. And some of you may know, of course, that the La Scala Opera House opens its season each year on the feast day of St. Ambrose, December 7th. Now, the canon at Sant'Ambrogio, now here I have a genealogical tree that I hope clarifies, I hope it doesn't confuse. The canon at Sant'Ambrogio, on your right, was Carlo Clerici, an older cousin to Antonio Giorgio Clerici, who was Carlo Archinto's grandson. So we have the first patron at the top. He and his wife had a daughter, Maria Archinto. She married Carlo Giorgio Clerici, and their son became Tiepolo's 3rd patron. So Casati is not here. So when Tiepolo came back in 37 to fresco in Sant'Ambrogio, he met Carlo Clerici. Now, why is this important? Well, obviously, at the time that he met him, Clerici married, the younger Clerici married, and he began to restructure and modernize the family palace. In other words, a network of elite family ties provides the background to Antonio Giorgio's decision to hire Tiepolo. The final trigger for this was Antonio Giorgio, the man at the bottom, his admission into the nobility in 1739. In other words, he was very, very wealthy, in fact, one of the wealthiest families in Milan, but he was not a nobleman. But in 1739, he was ennobled by who else but the daughter of Emperor Charles VI. And who was the daughter arriving in Milan at this time? The future Empress Maria Theresa. So as in the case with Casati, ennoblement and recognition by Vienna prompted Clerici to hire Tiepolo, the man who had already frescoed 5 ceilings in his grandfather's palace across town. Now, war has deprived us of the Arquinto ceilings, but we have photographs and oil sketches. The Casati ceiling has survived, no sketches, and 2 drawings that are provisionally linked. The clerici ceiling has happily endured. It's in very good state. It can be linked with almost 100 surviving drawings, a magnificent oil sketch, and a laudatory poem published the year of its completion, 1740. Now, I have just recently uncovered evidence that in May of that year, 1740, before Tiepolo went to Milan to fresco in the clerici ceiling, Marchese Clerici visited Venice to participate in 2 regattas in the spring of 1740, one celebrating the annual Feast of the Ascension, and the other marking, so Palazzo Clerici is the middle one, marking the arrival, oh, sorry, I'm skipping. This is the Palazzo Clerici on your right. It is now part of the University of Milan. So, the arrival in 1739 of Friedrich Christian, Prince of Saxony and future King of Poland. And on May, I think it was 3rd, 1740, a grand, magnificent regatta was thrown in his honor, and we know that Clerici contributed, paid for, funded boats for the 2 regattas, the one of Ascension Day and the one celebrating Friedrich Christian. We don't know what those boats look like, but we do have, and if any of you have loose change in your pockets, Tiepolo's remarkable drawing for a Venetian boat in one of the regattas, a drawing now on sale in a London gallery. I urge any of you who have the several millions to buy it. It is a very large drawing and a magnificent drawing. So it is very likely that while in Venice for these regattas, Clerici viewed Tiepolo's oil sketch for the fresco to be painted in his palace in Milan. Yet upon arriving, and here is the oil sketch in Texas, yet upon arriving in the city, Tiepolo did not reproduce this composition, either because Clerici did not okay it, or more likely, I suspect, because Tiepolo himself realized that it wouldn't work. Why? Because once in the palace, he realized that the proportions of the ceiling he had to fresco would not work with those of the oil sketch. So a moment of concentration, the ceiling is 4 times longer than it is wide, but the oil sketch is only 3 times longer than it is wide. So you simply cannot impose a design where the ratio is different from the final surface that it was going to be painted. The gallery is very long, 73 feet long, almost as long as what is termed a short Olympic swimming pool. There is no way, moreover, that the figure of Apollo, let's go back one, here, could have been seen from the principal entryway into the gallery. He would have been too far away, almost 35 feet away, particularly because the ceiling is 26 feet from the floor, not 40 feet from the floor. So whereas Tiepolo, and here's, I think, a major change in his art across the decade, repeated his bozzetto almost verbatim in the Arquinto fresco. So here is a sketch downstairs and the ceiling, the destroyed ceiling on the right. He drastically altered his oil sketch for the Clerici Palace a decade later. His approach changed remarkably. He was a very keen man. He even planned the new Clerici ceiling so that parts of it could be seen from the courtyard below. Slide on the left isolates the 5 windows of the gallery, and the red rectangle on the right shows you the ground plan of the gallery itself. If you stand in the courtyard with the shutters open, you can even see parts of the fresco. Although he changed the composition, he retained many of its figures, playing them across an elongated surface as if they emerge from an unfurled scroll. Now, a slide like this, ladies and gentlemen, is taken by a camera on a flat table that slowly moves across under the ceiling. I don't know how it works, but it's not, the human eye cannot see the ceiling like this, and the photographic lens cannot either. So this is a miracle of modern photography. We have Mercury on the right, looming in and out. we have Apollo now on a chariot, and we have Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn occupying half the ceiling. Can we imagine the creative process involved in this great pictorial orchestration? Tiepolo drew no fewer than 7 variations for Apollo, and these are the only ones that apparently survive. The oil sketch follows one of the ideas. This is a drawing in Washington, but the fresco does not, as you can see even from this close-up. Mercury began hovering above a river god in the drawing, then he stood still on the oil sketch, and finally he soars, almost balletically one might say, in the fresco. As I said, Tiepolo had to reconceive his composition to a surface whose length is 4 times its width. He fictively covered the entrances into the gallery, inserting feigned architectural vaults that, richly ornamented with garlands, fruits, and flowers, propel us inward. At this point, he invented one figure that he had never drawn, that he had never painted on the oil sketch, and that is, you can see 2 on each side, satyrs. In preparation, he drew satyrs more than 24 times, and these are some of those that survive. They sit in pairs, each is different from the others. They are male and female. They move in many different ways, and they snicker and grimace. And I suppose my favorite is this really foul fellow, now in the Princeton University Art Gallery. And we can compare this drawing with an Arquinto sheet downstairs to see Tiepolo's dramatic change in drawing technique across the decade, bold figures and rich washes bleeding, as it were, from shadow into light, and of course, the sunlight is the actual white of the paper. Another figure new to the fresco, no drawing for it, not on the sketch, is this nasty, grimacing dwarf at one of the 2 ends. No drawing is known for him at all. And with a touch of bizarre humor, Tiepolo had a lot of bizarre humor, Tiepolo gave him a pet, leashing the poor monkey by chain. Now, the dwarf is painted, he's fresco. The monkey, however, is projecting 3-dimensional stucco, and the chain is a real chain. It hangs, and you can buy it in a hardware store. Among the numerous other figures to appear on the clerici ceiling, some remained almost identical from the beginning to the end, from the drawings to the oil sketch and to the fresco. This female, for example, apparently changes little from the sheet to the fresco. On the fresco, she's an allegory of night, note the bat, fleeing from Apollo's sun chariot. But on the drawing, she is not night. She's another figure altogether. So she looks the same, but she's a different figure. This allegorical river god and his nymph alter from one medium to the other almost not at all, but note that Tiepolo turned and dirtied the sole of his foot on the fresco in blue. Another touch of humor, because obviously the river god muddied his foot in the river bank. Now, we've seen that Apollo and Mercury alter drastically from one phase to another. Bacchus, too. Here are 3 drawings for Bacchus. Here's Bacchus on the oil sketch on the far left, and here's jolly old Bacchus in the fresco on the right. But in the numerous adjustments marking Tiepolo's creative process, the greatest change, I think, impacted upon the trio of Jupiter, Venus, and Saturn. They occupy 1/2 of the vault, forming a powerfully descending trio. Saturn's wingtip, you can see it, Saturn's wingtip, and the wheel of Venus's chariot acting as connective filaments to the other half of the very long ceiling. Now, where is this trio on the oil sketch? Well, they're all there, but they're not together, occupying instead different halves of the canvas. So this is the same oil sketch, but 2 different ends. Venus is with Mars, her lover, not with Saturn. On this drawing, clearly when Tiepolo decided he wanted Saturn, he gave the Grand Reaper an hourglass, bottom left. The hourglass disappears on the fresco. Venus herself is a beauty, and is swathed in opulent drapery surrounded by lovebirds, while amorini fly about, and nearby roses in stucco along the corners perfume the air. Now I bring back an image that I showed you earlier, the Casati ceiling, again with the eagle. This Habsburg logo had to appear in a Milanese context. And the eagle appeared everywhere where patriotic imperial citizens and noblemen lived, even, as I saw 2 weeks ago in Brussels, on a Hanukkah menorah. In 1739, as I mentioned earlier, the newlywed Princess Maria Theresa visited Milan as heiress presumptive to her father's Habsburg throne, and clergy was ennobled. Neither the Austrian princess nor the Milanese nobleman, nor Tiepolo, knew beforehand, of course, that Emperor Charles VI would die in October of 1740, just as Tiepolo finished the fresco. I'm not saying that Venus looks like Maria Theresa. I'm just pitting all these beauties together. The emperor's death had been taken for granted for decades, because in 1720, Charles had no surviving sons, and in order to have his daughter Maria Theresa recognized, he overturned what is called Salic law, that is, with an edict called the Pragmatic Sanction, that only Maria Theresa could succeed him, despite the Salic law forbade the succession of female offspring. Tiepolo's brilliant idea to exalt Venus while Apollo opens a new day on the right, to make her and the chariot of the sun the two focal points of the fresco, and to turn Saturn, the grand reaper as I called him, away from the goddess so that time does not threaten her, leaves little doubt that Clerici and his painter are hailing a continued and benevolent Habsburg reign. Is it really difficult to appreciate Tiepolo's art, suffused as it is with a pictorial imagination that metaphorically, and I think literally, soars through the heavens? Now, before leaving the Clerici ceiling, I want to show you two details. Frescoes, yes, this detail begins. Frescoes are artifacts, objects, and materials as much as the canvases that we as Americans more usually see in museums. Fresco, as you know, requires a totally different process, different from oils on canvas. Here is one side of the Clerici ceiling, a figure of one of the winds outlined in red. Here is a close-up, and now, as if we had climbed a ladder, we see the painter's incisions cutting into the plaster or gesso to shape and model the figure, as well as the cloud below, which is mostly invisible from the floor. Here's a second detail. This time, a warrior, again, on one of the sides. Now, while the detail on the right makes the warrior look somewhat awkward, I can assure you that when you're there, it works. It works. He doesn't at all. Here is a closer detail. So you can see Tiepolo's brushwork and paint. Over the next years of the early 1740s, Giambattista undertook several major commissions, which were challenging in subject matter and mammoth in size, a result, I think, of his experiences in Milan. For the parish church of Verolanuova in the provinces midway between Verona and Milan, he painted two Hebraic subjects that Christian writers had interpreted as prefigurations of Christian events: the fall of manna on the left, signifying Christ as the bread of life, and the sacrifice of Melchizedek, connoting the sacrament of Eucharist. These are the small oils in Buenos Aires, which I have never seen, I have to say. As a proud father, I want to tell you that my daughter took these pictures a few weeks ago while in Buenos Aires. She loyally went to the museum and took these good slides. Each of these paintings measures 3 feet by 2 feet, 3 feet by 2 feet. Here are their massive altarpieces. Instead of 3 feet tall, 33 feet tall. Instead of 2 feet wide, 17 feet wide. And you note the doors below to appreciate the size of the canvases above. A year or two later, again in the provinces, but now in an elegant villa, Tiepolo frescoed 2 scenes from ancient history: the continents of Scipio on your left, and the family of Darius seeking clemency from Alexander the Great. but you have to see these within the context of the space. These, together with many others like them, plus the 3 fresco cycles in Milan, form the core of Tiepolo's greatness until age 45. Now, about 20 years later, in March 1762, at age 65, just before leaving Venice forever, as it turned out, to make his way to Madrid, where he worked for King Charles III of Spain, not the Charles we spoke about earlier, Tiepolo gave what today, here you see him 3 times, he gave what today we would call a press interview. The anonymous journalist printed for his readers Giambattista's own words on how he conceived his goals and sought to satisfy his clientele, his noble clientele. It was necessary, he said, I quote, that the painter's mind seek the sublime and heroic. It must reach for perfection itself. When Tiepolo made that statement in 1762, he had already frescoed on your left the colossal vault of the stairwell in the Archbishop's Palace in Würzburg, Germany, 75 miles northwest of Nuremberg, but he had yet to fresco on your right the ceiling of the throne room in the Royal Palace of Madrid. So you see, he did get around. His Milanese commissions of the 1730s were giant steps, and they prepared him for these and other immense undertakings. And they celebrate his pursuit of the sublime and the heroic during his half-century-long career from about 1720 to his death in 1770. Thank you.